Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of the blockchain series. Today I'm going to introduce you to Remix IDE, which is the best place to learn blockchain programming before you move on to a local developer environment. And I'll be covering a bit of code, however I'll leave most of it for the coming lessons. So the first time you load Remix IDE, you'll be introduced with a sort of tutorial. However, we'll just be skipping through that since I'll be explaining all of this. So the first thing you may notice is there's many things on the screen. However, don't be scared, I'll simplify everything for you and what we would need. So first thing, featured plugins, we don't really need anything except Solidity. So just click on this. However, even if you did not click on this, you could still get access to programming in Solidity. So now let me tell you what all of this stands for, the useful ones at least. So here, it's your file explorer. Here you'll have all your programs, all your contracts, all of those. And typically, you will start off with 4 folders with a bunch of scripts in each, a contracts folder with some predefined contracts, a script folders with deploying scripts, tests, and dependencies. However, we're going to clean this up a bit, so you could delete the most folders, only leave contracts. However, in contracts, we're going to be emptying it. Also, usually Remix would start with a readme.txt, which explains how to write smart contracts. However, I'll also be explaining this, so you won't need this. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the IDE and then we'll start making our first contract. So, first you have this, the Solidity Compiler. Here, what basically happens is you compile all your code. What that means is you take your code from our language, which is English, into machine code. And there's many different compiler versions because, as you'll see later on, Solidity is a constantly changing language and has constant updates. Next, you have the deploy and run transactions. Here's where we'll be deploying and running all our smart contracts. However, I will not cover this in depth right now. I'll leave it for another course. But basically here, you could choose if you want to do it on a virtual machine or actually into a blockchain. And then over here, you'll see deployed contracts. Currently, we have none. And you'll be able to run functions and everything you've coded. Okay, let's begin now with our first smart contract. We're going to be calling it simple storage.sol. It's really important to add .sol. However, if you did not, Remix will add it automatically. But it's basically the ending or the suffix of the file for Solidity. If you've ever coded before, you know most coding files have this. For example, JavaScript ends with .js and so forth. So when you hit enter, this will open. And to go full screen, first of all, X this out and click on the folder. And now you have your coding open and full screen. So now let's begin with how you start writing a smart contract. So before writing a smart contract, the first thing you have to do is define your Solidity version. There's many ways to do this. But first you have to say pragma Solidity. And then here, there's many different ways you can go about it. First of all, you could define the exact version you want. Let's say 0.8.7. And obviously, you have to end it with a semicolon, because as you'll see throughout Solidity, it's one of the languages where you need to end it with a semicolon. But there's many different ways to define the version. Let's say, for example, you want any version that's 0.8.7 or higher. You start off with this symbol. So what you're basically telling them is you could compile this in this version or higher. However, let's say you wanted a range. For example, you wanted it between 0.8.7 and 0.9.0. You'd say it has to be greater than and equal to 0.8.7, however, less than 0.9.0. So basically right here, all versions work between 0.8.7 and 0.9.0. However, the second you put the compiler version on 0.9.0, it would not work. So now I want to speak about one really important thing, and that is comments. Since you're learning, this is actually a really essential tool for you, since you could write comments next to code explaining what it is, what it does, maybe comments to how you can understand it and stuff like that. So to make a comment, just put 2 backslashes and then write whatever you want. And whatever you write does not affect the code. For example, I could say, hey, how are you? And that would not affect our code. So for here, I'm just gonna return the version back to 0.8.7 because it's one of the most stable ones. And I'll write a comment for you guys just to remember, and I'll say using 0.8.7 compiler version. Alright, now the next thing, first thing I'll show you is you could right now compile your code. So once you click this, it'll compile. However, it throws an error saying SPDX license identifier is not provided. So what exactly does that mean? So most compilers will throw an error for this, but what it basically says is you didn't identify the SPDX license. So what is this? Basically, when you're sharing code, you need to identify the license so they understand how you can share the code. However, it's not that complicated. All we need to do is, first of all, use 2 backslashes. So this is basically a comment, and write SPDX dash license dash identifier, 2 dots over each other, and now you could say what license you want. Now, mainly we would be using MIT since it's the one with the least limitations. Now, if we go over here and compile again, that error is gone. However, if you noticed, it says no contracts compiled yet, and that is because we haven't created our contract. So now we're going to be creating our first contract. How do we define this though? So we start by using a keyword in Solidity called contract. It's really that simple. Then you name your contract. We will name it simple storage, and then you gotta open and close these squiggly brackets and click enter. Right now, anything you type in between the squiggly brackets will be part of your contract. Okay, now we are going to be speaking about data types. So I'll be speaking about 5 main data types right now: uint, int, string, address, and bytes. So first thing, a uint. What is that? It stands for unsigned integer. So what that means is only positive numbers. So you could say, for example, uint fav number equals to 10. This basically is an unsigned integer because as you've seen, it's positive. If I added negative, however, if I had a negative and tried to compile, it would throw an error saying it's a uint, but you gave it a sign. Now, if I compiled it without the sign, it would save. Also, for people who don't want to click compile every time, on MacBook you could click Command S, and on Windows Control S. Also, if you wanted to auto-compile, you could take this option. Next, what's an integer? An integer is basically a uint, however you could use signs. So I could say uint number, or num, equals to negative 10. If I compiled, it still compiles properly. And however, I want to mention something. In Solidity, you have an option to mention how many bytes each uint, int, or any data type has. For example, uint, actually not all data types, however, uint, it's really special to mention this. For example, I could say 256. I'll explain this more in depth in another lesson. However, bytes are explained in many videos on YouTube, so if you wanted, you could research on that. And basically, the simplest and lowest form of bytes is 8. And it continues to increase by multiples of 8. For example, 8, 16, and all that. And if you do not define how many bytes, it automatically sets to 256, which is the max. So I'm going to leave them at 256. Okay, next we have string. If you've coded before, you've seen this before, and it's basically a string of letters, or a word, or a string of words. But basically, let's say fav word equals to dog. Obviously ending it with a semicolon, as you've seen that's a pattern between everything. So right here, let's compile, and it doesn't throw an error, because string is a string of letters or words. But let's say I said string fav word equals to 6, and I tried compiling, they'd say, oh, that's a string, however you gave it a number. So let's return that back to dog, compile, and it's successful. So the last 2 data types are address and bytes. So address, as you've seen, it's a keyword in Solidity, is basically any address of a wallet. For example, let's copy my address and put address user. This is where it could be helpful in your program because you could put the addresses of users and then say equals to and then paste in an address, obviously ending it with a semicolon. Let's compile, and as you've seen, no compile errors. However, let's try something interesting. Let's put two quotation marks, basically setting it like a string. Do you think it would compile? Put your answers down in the comment below. And nope, it does not compile, because an address has to be defined with no quotation marks. Okay, let's compile now. And bytes, which I'll be explaining in a separate lesson sometime in the course, is basically anything, however, it could be stored as bytes. Let's say bytes 8, for example, equals to cat. Let's compile. Uh-oh, what's wrong? We did not name it. Let's say bytes name equals to cat. It did compile. Bytes is more complicated than all the others, so I'll be explaining our lesson alone. But that's it for today's video, and in the next video we'll be starting to do functions and explaining more in depth. Thank you guys for watching.